You're lying in a hospital bed. Machines are beeping. Someone is holding your hand. The TV in the corner is probably playing something nobody's watching. And somewhere inside your skull, 3 pounds of tissue that has spent your entire life doing literally everything. Every thought, every embarrassing memory, every 2 a.m. worry spiral, every moment you've ever felt truly alive. That tissue is about to do something that scientists are only just starting to understand. And here's the part nobody puts in the pamphlet. It doesn't just go quiet. In some cases, right at the edge of death, the brain may briefly become more active, more organized, more electrically alive-looking than it's been in years. Researchers recorded it on EEG. They watched it happen in humans. They watched it happen in animals first. And they're still arguing about what it actually means in peer-reviewed journals as of 2023. So whatever version of death you've got in your head right now, the clean, peaceful, lights-out version, go ahead and update it, because the actual science is considerably weirder than that. Okay, so first, let's completely destroy the version of this story you already have in your head. Most people picture death like a power cut. Heart stops, lights go out, everything stops at once. Like someone pulled the plug on a TV. Clean, instantaneous. The whole thing wraps up in a second and a half. Done. That's not what the research shows, not even close. Death, for the brain, isn't a switch. It's a process with stages and a timeline. And during that timeline, some genuinely strange things can happen that scientists are still actively debating. The better image isn't a power cut. It's more like a city losing electricity borough by borough during a massive storm. And in a few specific neighborhoods, certain blocks actually flicker brighter right before they go dark for good, which is either beautiful or terrifying, depending on your mood, and probably both. That's what we're actually talking about. And to get there, you need to understand what your brain actually needs to stay alive, which is, honestly, more than you'd expect from something that fits in a salad bowl. Your brain is an energy monster. It's about 2% of your body weight. It eats roughly 20% of your body's oxygen supply. And unlike your muscles, which can stockpile fuel and run for a while on reserve, your brain has almost no energy storage of its own. It doesn't have a backup generator. It doesn't have a few extra bars of battery in the corner. It just runs constantly, full tilt, demanding fresh oxygen and glucose from your blood every single second. And if that delivery line cuts, the clock starts immediately. When your heart stops, blood flow stops. When blood flow stops, oxygen stops reaching brain tissue. Medline Plus is blunt about this. Permanent brain damage can begin in as little as 4 minutes without oxygen. Brain cells, according to the NINDS, can begin dying within about 5 minutes of oxygen deprivation. 5 minutes. That's less time than most people spend staring at a restaurant menu before they realize they're getting the burger anyway. That number drives everything else in this video. The brain's extreme oxygen dependency is the reason for the electrical chaos, the surges, the experiences, the waves of collapse, all of it. There's almost no buffer. When the fuel line cuts, everything cascades fast. So let's follow that cascade in order, because the sequence really matters. The best scientific window into the dying brain comes from cardiac arrest. Sam Parnia, a researcher whose work has appeared in the journal Resuscitation, has described cardiac arrest as the final step in the dying process, regardless of cause, and one of the closest physiological models we have for studying death itself. Why cardiac arrest specifically? Because it's sudden, it's measurable, and sometimes, with CPR, defibrillation, or emergency medicine, it can be reversed, which means researchers can actually study what happens at the edge and then, in some cases, interview people who came back from it. And what those people report has been quietly bothering scientists for decades. Around 10% of cardiac arrest survivors in earlier research developed memories consistent with what we'd call near-death experiences, not vague, hazy hallucinations. Structured, detailed, emotionally intense. People describe these memories as more real than anything else that's ever happened to them, which is a genuinely strange sentence to say about a moment when your heart wasn't beating and someone was actively slamming their palms into your sternum. But here we are. Before we get to the experiences, though, before we get to the part that actually makes people uncomfortable at parties, we need to understand what the brain is doing electrically during those minutes, because that's where it gets genuinely weird. In 2023, a team at the University of Michigan, led by Gang Xu and Jimo Borjigan, published a study in the journal PNAS. They were monitoring 4 comatose patients who were dying after cardiac arrest. All 4 were being tracked on EEG, the device that measures electrical activity in the brain, and at a certain point, the ventilator support keeping them going was removed. When that happened, 2 of the 4 patients showed something the researchers did not expect. Their heart rates increased. and there was a surge of gamma wave activity in the brain. Now, gamma waves are the fastest brain waves we can measure. They show up in specific situations: dreaming, visual hallucinations, certain altered states of consciousness, and, here's the piece that matters, highly organized conscious thought. The surge appeared in what researchers called a posterior hot zone, a region of the brain specifically tied to consciousness, dreaming, and visual processing. Read that back. 2 patients who were in the process of dying after ventilators were removed briefly showed electrical patterns that are associated with conscious awareness. Right at the edge, their hearts were failing, and their brains were briefly doing something that, if you showed it to a neurologist without context, they might describe as focused or even alert. Now, the researchers were extremely careful here, and this is the part that matters a lot. They explicitly warned against overclaiming. Because those patients didn't survive, the team couldn't connect the gamma surge they recorded to any actual experience those patients had. 4 people is also a tiny sample. This is not proof of some great mystery being solved. What it is proof that the dying human brain can, in at least some cases, produce a burst of organized electrical activity near death, which is not nothing. That's not what quietly shutting down looks like. And here's what makes it harder to wave away. It wasn't the first time this had been observed. 10 years earlier, Jimo Borjigin and colleagues ran a similar study, this time in rats. In 2013, they published findings showing a transient surge of synchronized gamma oscillations after cardiac arrest in rats. Shortly after their hearts stopped, the animals' brains showed a global wave of high-frequency electrical activity, coordinated, not random noise. So this isn't one weird human outlier. It's a pattern that showed up in animals first, then appeared again in dying humans. The dying brain's apparent final electrical surge is reproducible enough across species that it can't just be dismissed as a fluke. Scientists still disagree about what it means, but the pattern is real, and it keeps showing up, and it fits with something even bigger that researchers have been documenting in the dying brain, something called terminal spreading depolarization, which sounds like the name of a bad prog rock album, but is actually one of the most important, and honestly, one of the most haunting, findings in all of neuroscience. In 2018, Jens P. Dreyer and colleagues published a study in the Annals of Neurology. The title was Terminal Spreading Depolarization and Electrical Silence in Death of Human Cerebral Cortex. Here's what that means in non-neuroscience PhD language. When brain cells run out of oxygen and energy, they lose the ability to maintain their normal electrical charge. They start to depolarize, their internal electrical balance collapses, and crucially, this doesn't happen to every cell at once, simultaneously, like flipping a breaker. It spreads like a wave, a slow-moving, irreversible electrical failure rolling across the cortex, region by region. Terminal spreading depolarization is not the power cut. It's the blackout moving neighborhood by neighborhood across the city, and eventually, there's nothing left lit. And the electrical silence that follows? That's a completely different state from the living brain at rest. It's not sleep. It's not unconsciousness. It's the end of electrical activity in the cortex, which is, to put it plainly, what the end looks like when measured from the outside. So now you've got the sequence. Oxygen drops, cells lose energy, some brains briefly surge with gamma activity in the region linked to dreaming and consciousness, then a wave of depolarization moves across the cortex and electrical silence follows. But here's what that sequence still doesn't answer. What does any of it actually feel like? And that's where the survivor accounts come in, and why they're so hard to set aside neatly. Sam Parnia and his team ran a large-scale study called AWARE-2, Awareness during Resuscitation II, published in the journal Resuscitation in 2023. They were studying consciousness and awareness during CPR. What do people actually experience while their heart has stopped and trained professionals are literally jumping on their ribcage? The study found 4 categories of experience that survivors reported. 2 of 28 interviewable survivors reported actual awareness of what was happening around them during resuscitation, CPR-induced consciousness. Others reported what the paper calls recalled death experiences, structured memories formed during or around the time of cardiac arrest. NYU Langone's summary of AWARE-2 described something that stops you cold. Some patients showed brainwave patterns linked to conscious thought up to an hour after their hearts stopped. An hour. That's long enough to watch an entire episode of something you've been putting off. And somewhere inside that window, these patients' brains were producing electrical patterns associated with awareness. What do survivors actually describe? Some of the most consistent themes are awareness of medical staff working on them, a sensation of leaving the body and watching from above, movement toward light, an overwhelming sense of peace, a complete absence of fear, encounters with people who had died, and, this one, a life review. A compressed, vivid, emotionally intense replay of their own memories. That last one gets its own moment. Because the life flashing before your eyes thing is not just something screenwriters invented to pad out a dramatic scene. It shows up in near-death accounts with enough consistency that researchers have spent serious time trying to explain it. Under extreme oxygen deprivation, the brain's memory networks, emotional processing systems, and self-referential circuits are all being hammered simultaneously. Stress chemistry is flooding everything. Time perception, which is itself a construction your brain generates, not a thing that exists independently, may be completely destabilized. Gamma activity, linked to fast integrated conscious processing, may be briefly surging. In that context, a compressed, emotionally supercharged replay of meaningful memories isn't mystical. It may be exactly what an oxygen-depleted, gamma-surging, memory-saturated brain does right before it runs out of capacity to do anything at all. Not a cosmic highlight reel handed to you from outside. Just your brain firing everything it has, all at once, because the clock is running out, and your memory and emotion systems happen to be the ones with the most stored up to fire. But that still doesn't explain terminal lucidity, and terminal lucidity is the part of this story that genuinely makes neurologists scratch their heads. Some researchers call it paradoxical lucidity. Here's what it is. A person with advanced dementia, someone who hasn't been able to hold a coherent conversation, recognize family members, or track a simple sentence for years, sometimes, right before they die, comes back. Suddenly. Unexpectedly. For a few hours, sometimes for a day. They're clear. They recognize people. They have conversations that make complete sense. They say things their families will carry for the rest of their lives. Think about how strange that is from a neuroscience standpoint. This is a brain so severely deteriorated it couldn't reliably maintain basic cognitive function for years, and right at the end, it somehow pulls it together. A 2019 paper in Alzheimer's and Dementia defined paradoxical lucidity as unexpected, spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness in a patient with severe cognitive impairment. A 2023 paper looking at healthcare worker reports confirmed it's something clinicians actually observe at end of life, recognized enough to be defined, studied, and published. Nobody knows why. The working theories involve a temporary removal of inhibitory processes that had been suppressing whatever residual function existed. Maybe the dying process itself strips away certain layers of brain activity in an order that briefly unmasks coherence before eliminating it entirely. Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. A brain that should, by all appearances, be incapable of that moment somehow has it anyway. It doesn't happen to everyone. It doesn't happen on a schedule. But it happens often enough that it's got a name, a definition, and peer-reviewed papers, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, this is real, we just can't fully explain it yet. Now here's the part that doesn't get nearly enough coverage, because it doesn't make for a comforting story. Surviving cardiac arrest is not just about getting the heart restarted. The heart coming back isn't the end of the danger for the brain. It might actually be the beginning of a second problem. A 2021 review in Nature Reviews, Neurology lays it out. Post-cardiac arrest brain injury comes from two separate processes. First, ischemia, the oxygen deprivation when the heart is stopped. Second, and this is the one that surprises people, reperfusion injury, the damage that can happen when blood flow returns. When oxygen-rich blood rushes back into cells that have been starved of it, inflammation spikes, oxidative stress hits hard. Cells that were already under stress face a second wave of damage on top of the first one. It's like your house flooding and then someone fixing the pipes so fast that the water pressure bursts something else on the way back up. This is why patients after cardiac arrest can remain in comas, require intensive neurological monitoring, and why EEG, the same tool recording gamma surges, is used to help evaluate recovery trajectories in these patients, even though interpreting those patterns is complex and the ethical stakes involved are enormous. Your brain can survive clinical death and then be injured by its own resuscitation. That sentence should get more attention than it does. Here's a distinction that matters and that most people never hear explained cleanly. Clinical death, heart stopped, breathing stopped, no effective circulation, can sometimes be reversed. That's the whole premise of CPR. That's why the cardiac arrest research exists. People come back from clinical death and we can study what they experienced while they were there. Brain death is completely different. Brain death means the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem, the part that runs breathing, blood pressure, consciousness, and your most basic reflexes. A 2023 consensus guideline from the American Academy of Neurology, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Child Neurology Society, and the Society of Critical Care Medicine updated the standards for determining brain death in adults and children. A person who meets proper brain death criteria is legally and medically dead in the vast majority of countries. even if a machine is maintaining some cardiac function, because medicine eventually had to invent a more precise definition of dead when technology made it possible to keep a heart beating in a body with no functioning brain. Which is, honestly, a sentence that says a lot about how complicated the 20th century got. A heart can sometimes be restarted. A brainstem can't. The line between life and death isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a question of irreversibility. And the question that actually matters, medically, isn't has the body stopped. It's, can the brain and body be restored? So let's bring all of this directly to you, because at some point, abstract neuroscience has to land somewhere personal. You have roughly 86 billion neurons in your brain. Right now, while you're watching this, those neurons are firing in patterns that produce your entire experience of existing. Every memory you have, your most embarrassing moment, the face of someone you love, the specific taste of something from childhood, what you were worried about 3 weeks ago that you've already half forgotten, stored as patterns of synaptic connection in that tissue. Your personality, your specific sense of humor, the exact flavor of anxiety you get before a difficult conversation. All of it, encoded electrically and chemically in 3 pounds of biological material that is working extremely hard right now to keep running. And all of it depends on continuous oxygen delivery. 4 minutes. That's the margin. 4 minutes without blood flow, and the damage begins to become permanent. When it ends, and it ends for everyone, which is a fact that tends to sit differently the longer you look at it, your brain won't just switch off. The oxygen will drop. The cells will start failing. In some cases, there may be a brief surge of organized gamma activity in the posterior hot zone, the region linked to dreaming and conscious processing. Then a wave of electrical depolarization will begin moving across your cortex. Then the electrical silence. Whether any of that produces an experience, whether there's anything happening in there that feels like something, is a question science hasn't answered yet. That's not a cop-out. That's where the actual science is right now. The 2023 University of Michigan PNAS study recorded the gamma surge, but the patients whose brains produced it didn't survive to describe it, so the researchers can tell you the wave happened. They cannot tell you what it was like from the inside, or whether there was an inside at all. The near-death experience accounts come from people who came back, which means, by definition, they didn't reach the final irreversible stage. What they experienced happened in the territory between clinical death and brain death. That territory is real, measurable, and clearly not always silent. But it's not the same as knowing what the last moment actually is. We can measure the oxygen dropping. We can record the electrical surges. We can watch the depolarization wave move across the cortex on an EEG monitor. We can interview people who came close enough to describe it. But the final subjective moment, if there is one, is still one of the deepest unresolved questions in all of neuroscience. So here's where you are now, back in that hospital bed with the beeping machines and someone holding your hand. You know things the person in that bed probably doesn't. You know the brain isn't going to just shut off like a TV. You know that somewhere in the next few minutes, there may be a surge of gamma waves in the exact region linked to dreaming. You know a wave of electrical change will eventually move across the cortex. You know that in some people with dementia who hadn't recognized their families in years, the very end can bring a sudden, inexplicable window of clarity that nobody can fully explain. You know that some survivors come back with memories they describe as the most real experience of their lives. None of that tells you what it feels like to be inside it. Science hasn't gotten there yet, but it tells you that whatever is happening in that room, in that skull, is not nothing. It's not simple. And the brain doing all of it, the same brain that has been running every thought and memory and fear this person has ever had, is not going quietly. It might, right at the end, briefly look more organized than it has in years, and the machine in the corner measuring it has no idea what to make of that either.